Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Kiddushin Daf Pei, getting close to our siyum. For those of you who have not yet signed up, please do so. The link is in the WhatsApp chat for Friday night's dinner, which will double as a siyum, not only on Maseches Kiddushin, but also on Seder Nashim Baruch Hashem, the halfway mark of all of the Sidarim and Shas, and we only have a couple blot left, and then we'll be there. Chaste Hashem. On Shabbos, we'll be starting Maseches Baba Kama and Seder Nezikin, of course. Maseches Baba Kama is known as a challenging Masechta in certain prakim. We'll get there and we'll get through it as we did. Once we do Yevamos, everything else becomes reasonable. So we're gonna be great. We were learning a sugya yesterday, and one of the features of the sugya that we learned is we can assume that a child belongs to a mother when we see that natural clinginess that a child has to a mother. But the Gemara wants to qualify that just a little bit in regards to certain areas of halacha. And on the very bottom line of Ayin Testament Beis, the Gemara says as follows: Amar Reish Lakish, turning to the top of Pei Amud Aleph, Lo Shanu, when do we say, as Rashi highlights, Desamchinan Akruchin, that we rely on the connection between a child and its mother based on the clinginess? Ela bekoche hagvul. That's true in regards to koche hagvul, aka Truma. Aval b'yuchsin, as it relates to yichus, we actually don't rely on that enough. Instead, we would need edim. For Rav Yochanan Amar, I disagree. Afilu b'yuchsin. The clinginess factor is not just stam. It's really halachic, and it has teeth, and it goes all the way to the end zone. And we actually hold, according to Rav Yochanan, that even as it relates to yuchsin, the fact that we see a child clinging to his mother or her mother, that is enough of a sign that that child has yichus, proper yichus back to the mother. But Azar Rav Yochanan, the time made this is l'shitasa, that he holds that kruchin is enough for yuchsin. How so? Pei Amud Aleph, 3 lines down. Damar Reb Chia bar Abba Amar Rav Yochanan. Malkin ala chazakos, that based on a chazaka Rabbi Yochanan holds, we give malkos. We're going to go through each of the things that Rabbi Yochanan is now going to say. The first is that we get malkos from chazakos. Soklin v'sorfen, we even give skila and sreifa ala chazakos. And well, even that's very odd. Okay, if you could just hear that in a vacuum, we will give skila or sreifa based on a chazaka. That's crazy. We'll see what that case is. The ein sorfen truma al hachazakos, but we are not soref truma on a chazaka. So let's go through each of these 3 statements of Rav Yochanan. Malkin al chazakos ke Rav Yehuda. What does Rav Yehuda hold? To Amar Rav Yehuda, huchzaka nida b'shchenoseha. Let's say that a woman is assumed by her neighbors to be a nida based on the clothes she's wearing, based on her current status. And then Ba'ala loke ala mishum nida. If the husband were to then cohabit with her while she is under this chazaka of nidus, the halacha is that the husband would get malkos based on that tashmish amita, but that's really only based on a chazaka. It's not based on edim, it's just based on the context of what she's wearing and how she's behaving. Soklan v'sorfan ala chazakos. What is a scenario where we would give skila or sreifa based on a chazaka? That's Rabba bar Rav Huna. To Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna, ish v'isha, tinok v'tinokes, a man and a woman, a baby boy or a baby girl, shehigdilu b'soch habayis. They grew up in the same home. Let's say that I eat over at someone's house, and I start eating at their house when the little kids are toddlers, they're little babies, and I watch the family grow up. So the halacha is that if they all grew up together, shehigdilu b'soch habayis, halacha is a quarter of the way down on Pei Amud Aleph, niskalin ze al ze v'nisrafin ze al ze, that if the mother and the son cohabit, or if the father and the daughter cohabit, or if the siblings cohabit, in those cases they get sreifa. But it's only based on the chazaka that I know that they've lived in the same house. It's not edus proper, it's just a chazaka. Amar Reb Shimon ben Pazi, he says, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Mishum bar kapar, ma'aseh b'isha shebas Yerushalayim. There was a story of a woman who lived in Yerushalayim, Betinok murkav la al ksefa, and when her children were young, her son would ride on her shoulders. There's a little bit of a shoulder ride. V'higdilaso, and then when the child grew up, uva aleha, the son and that mother had tashmish amita. So the din is v'havim lebezdin uskalum, one of the rare cases where we see that a bezdin actually did skila, and it wasn't even based on edus, it was just based on the chazaka that they grew up and lived in the same home. What? The Gemara says, Lo mipnei shebna vadai. So straight, explicit in the Gemara. It's not because that it was definitely her son. Yeah, you need hasra, but we don't need edim. And the Gemara says it's not because there's vados. There is no vados over here, but rather it's mipnei shekarach achara.
They didn't deny it.
Did they deny it? No, they didn't deny it. It happened. And then that was the second case. The first case we had said is that a man who sleeps with his wife who has a chezkas nida, he gets malkos. The second case we just discussed is if family members who grew up together, if one cohabits with another, chayev skila or sreifa, depending on who slept with who, even though it's only a chazaka. And the third case, and we're 1/3 of the way down on Pei Amud Aleph, ve'ein sorfen truma al hachazakos, we do not burn truma based on a chazaka. The Amar of Shimon ben Pazi, sorfen al hachazakos, Rav Yochanan Amar, ein sorfen. So we see, these are the three shitas of Rav Yochanan, and as you can see, Yuchsin would be a part of this as well, at least by implication. He doesn't say so expressly, but it does seem to be that even Yuchsin would be included here. The Azdula Ta'amayhu, Reish Lakish, and Rav Yochanan, their machlokas has its precedence in another Mishnah. Now, of course, Rav Shimon ben Lakish and Rav Yochanan are not Tanaim, but as we'll soon see, their opinions can be found in the following Mishnah, at least as an analysis of the following Mishnah. Azdula Ta'amayhu Ditnan. This is a Mishnah in Maseches Taros. Tinok shenimsa b'tzad ha'isa u'batzek biyado. Let's say that there's a little baby. He's sitting next to the rising dough that the mother's about to use to make challah, and the child's holding a little bit of dough in his hands. Namely, we know that the tinok reached in and grabbed a little bit of dough from the rising challah. Rav Meir mitayer v'chachamim mitamin mipnei shedarko shel tinok l'tapeach. We know that Rav Meir is going to say that this challah is fine, even though the tinok touched it. And the Chachamim say, no way. Children touch everything. They play with shrutzim in the garbage. Not typical for us, though things like that have happened in many of our homes over the years, because kids touch disgusting things. So if we know for sure that the child is holding dough in his hand, and it's definitely from the dough that's rising, we need to assume, say the Chachamim, that the challah is also going to be tamei. V'havinan ba, when we analyze this, we're forced to ask, my ta'amei de Rav Meir. Why does Rav Meir say that the bread is tahor? After all, we know that children play with challah. We know that children also play with shrutzim. So says the Gemara, kasavar, because Rav Meir has a double svara. Number one, kasavar rov tinokos metapchen u'miut ein metapchen. We know that it's true that most children play with disgusting things, including shrutzim, though there's a percentage of children who are very neat. They're very picky, and they won't touch a dead animal. My children would not touch dead animals. That's part one. And the isa bechezkas tara omedes, and the isa, the dough that the woman has prepared, has a chazaka of tara. So here's what the Gemara says is the svara of Rav Meir: the samuch miuta lechazaka and isra leruba. The miut gets close to the chazaka of the tara, and what happens is that isra leruba, the rov tinokos metapchen, gets lowered, and therefore we rely on the miut, and therefore Rav Meir says that this child is going to hold that it's tahor. That Rav Meir is going to hold that if the child touches the challah, it's tahor, because even though we know he touched it, but the rov has been ruined. The rov of the fact that rov of children do touch disgusting things like shrutzim is offset by the chazaka that the dough is tahor. V'rabbanan, how would the rabbis respond to that? Miuta keman de lesadami, ruba v'chazaka, ruba adif. A beautiful shas concept. We don't look at the minority. We know that it's possible that there might be a slight minority of children who don't touch things that are disgusting, but when it comes to our case, the miut is keman de lesadami. So says the Gemara, ruba v'chazaka, ruba adif. We therefore assume that a rov of children are going to touch things that are disgusting, including a sheret, and therefore the Gemara says, the Mishnah says from Taros that we assume that when the child is holding the challah, that the challah is going to be tamei. And on this, we see the machlokas, Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan. Amar Reish Lakish, we're 2/3 of the way down, a little bit more. Mishum Reb Hoshaya, Zohi Shesorfen Aleh Satruma. This is a case scenario where we see Sreifas Truma. And Rav Yochanan Amar, Ein Zo Chazaka Shesorfen Alea Truma. So therefore, this is our Machlokes, Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and we therefore see that the Rav Yochanan that we saw earlier in our page, quoted in the name of Rav Chia bar Abba Amar Rav Yochanan, the Machlokes, Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan about whether or not we're Soref Truma based on a Chazaka, really has its roots in the world of Maseches Taros. What is a case scenario, asks the Gemara, where Rav Yochanan would agree to Sreifas Truma based on a Chazaka? Ela Ezo Chazaka le Rav Yochanan shesorfen alesa Truma kiditnan. It's actually Kiditanya, 9-10 lines from the bottom of the page. Isa besocha bayis. Let's say that there is dough in the house, and this is an odd scenario. Ushratzim utzvardaim metaplen sham. There are body parts of shratzim and frogs. Now, the shmona shratzim are metamin, but the frog is not one of the shmona shratzim. So if one of the shmona shratzim gets mixed in with the challah, tameh, because the shmona shratzim are metame. But a frog is not one of the shmona shratzim. So says the Gemara, v'nimsa chatichos be'isa. If we find that there are actually some of these small, gross little limbs of a frog, I remember dissecting frogs when I was in college. I think I was in college at the time, maybe, it was probably college. We dissected basically every animal under the sun, lampreys, cats, like domestic cats, sharks. It was disgusting. Bio major. And we had to dissect everything. And then we'd walk around the room and our professor would put a flag in a body part with a number on it. We had a piece of paper. We had to say which artery it was, which muscle it was, whatever. Disgusting. I managed. It was very helpful for my current skills as I do some other cutting, but nevertheless.
Some people love it, some people hate it.
I did enjoy it at the time. I loved the complexities. I didn't like the smell. The formaldehyde was a vicious smell, and I have a sensitive nose. It's very overwhelming. But other than that, I didn't mind the cutting parts, but they were dead, so it didn't really matter. All right, anyways, let's talk about important things. So the Gemara says that let's say the dough has a limb in it of one of these animals. Im rov shratzim tmeya. If most of the body parts that are in that home are from shratzim, we know that the shmona shratzim are metame, so therefore the bread would be tame. And im rov tzvardeim, if most of them were tzvardeya, that they were actually frogs, that's not shmona shratzim, and therefore tahora, the bread would still be tahor. It would be disgusting, but it would not be tame, because the frogs are not considered to be part of the shmona shratzim category. You can't eat it, you have to remove it. The question is, was the contact b'maga, was it metame, the isa? So had it been from the shmona shratzim, that would have been metame. But because the tzvardeya is not one of the shmona shratzim, it's disgusting. You have to make sure there's no remnants of it left, because it's usher to eat pasha. That's the animals, the treif animal. But can't do shchita and frog. It's not allowed. The animal is not kosher. So that's the machlokas that we see between Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan, whether or not we assume by a classical chazaka, whether or not we can be soref truma. And the Gemara says 6 lines from the bottom, Tanya kavase de Rav Yochanan, we have a brisa that supports the shita of Rav Yochanan as follows. Shnei dvarim ein bohem das lishael. There are 2 things where there's no das to ask any questions. Ve'asaum chachamim kemashi yesh b'hem das lishael. But we made it as though it's possible to ask. What is this talking about? Tinok ve'od acheres. The case of Tinok. That's the case that we started with a little bit earlier today. That's a case of a Tinok who's holding challah next to. The Tinok is sitting next to a bowl of Isa that was tahor, and he's holding a piece. And Tino Kada Amran, that's the case. V'oda cheres maihi. What's the other case of Isa? Says the Gemara, Isa b'socha bayis, that if we have dough inside of a house, the tarnagolin, there are chickens, and umashkin tmein sham. You have chickens, and then you have liquids that are tame and mitame. So says the Gemara, Nimtzu, turning to the top of Peyamid Beis, Nikurim, if we see Nikurim Be'isa, you know how like pigeons or chickens, they like take little bites with their beak and they quickly move back. You can see those little marks in the dough. We know that the chicken took bites out of the dough, that we know. So the halacha is tolen. We have to be tola. There's an element of suffix over here, and we are not going to be so reif this. That's what we said about Rav Yochanan on the last page. That's what we're bringing a raya for in the Brisa, that Rav Yochanan holds that when there is only a chazaka, that we are not going to be so reif. We're going to be told lo ochlin lo sorfin. So says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, lo shanu ela b'mashkim levanim. This is only true in regards to liquids that are white, light-colored liquids, because what we're assuming is that perhaps the chicken stuck its beak into the tamei liquid and then went over and took a bite out of the challah. Now, if it's a white liquid, we won't be able to see the remnant of the white liquid that the chicken first stuck its beak into and then transferred over the tamei liquid over to the challah, to the isa. Aval, third line of Peyamid Beis, aval b'mashkin adumim. If in fact it was a red liquid that was tamei, and first the chicken stuck its beak in the red liquid that was tamei, and then went after the isa, well, im isa denikar meida yediyah, we'll see the red liquid. Because it's red, it's bright red. So therefore, perhaps we'll know as to whether or not the chicken started with the tamei red liquid and transferred over to the challah. We would know. It's asked the Gemara, Dilma bil asinhu isa. Perhaps even the red color would get absorbed into the challah, and therefore we wouldn't know as to whether or not the chicken drank the tamei liquid followed by sticking its beak into the isa. Maybe we wouldn't know. Amar Rav Yochanan, Davar zeh shama b'ribi. You think that Ribi, this chashuv person, referring to the author, the second line of this page, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, upirusha lo shama, that he didn't have any way to explain this. He's a big Talmud Chacham. You don't think he thought of the distinction that you thought of between red liquids and white liquids? Of course he did. Amar Rav Yochanan Davar Lo Shanu, says the Gemara 6 lines down. Ele b'mashkin silulim shebavoa shel tinok nikarba. We're talking about liquids that are so clear that you can actually see the reflection of a child in it. We know that when liquids are very clear with still waters, you can see a reflection in a clear liquid. Let's talk about water. Let's say you're looking out on the water and you can see the reflection of the sun in the water. But if the water was mayim machurim, aval mashkim machurim lo, you could not tell the difference. This is the distinction of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. It really has nothing to do with the color. It has to do with how cloudy the water is, the liquid is. So if, says the Gemara, the water was very cloudy, then we assume that the dough will not absorb it. And therefore, if it's a cloudy liquid, then we'll know if the chicken put his beak into the cloudy liquid and then put it into the isa, because it won't absorb well. But if in fact it was a liquid that did have a reflection out of it, a very clear liquid, then we would not be able to tell. New Mishnah and Peyamid Beis. Here we're going to start learning about the halachos of yichud. Yichud has a lot of different iterations to it. There are certain aspects that are d'oraisa and certain aspects that are d'Rabbanan, and the Gemara is now going to go through some of those halachos. The Mishnah opens up 10 lines down on Peyamid Beis. The Mishnah says, Lo yisyached adam im shtei nashim. A man is not allowed to be alone with two women. Aval isha achas misyachedes im shnei anashim. But one woman is allowed to be alone with two men. Seemingly a strange assertion. Rashi explains why we distinguish between one woman with two men and one man with two women. So let's review the din in the Mishnah. A man is not allowed to be with two women. Rashi says, im beis nashim, 10 lines down at the opening of Rashi's on the Mishnah. Bipnei shedaitan kala, ushtehen nochos lehis patos. The two of them wouldn't mind being seduced, wouldn't mind being convinced to do something. So they're both going to do the same thing. So we assume that a man should not be alone with a woman, and Rashi's giving us the underpinning of yichud, which is that we're afraid something might happen. And in a scenario where there's two women, we assume that the two of them could be convinced to do something inappropriate. Therefore, there's an isur yichud in that case. Masha ein kain, if you have one woman and two men, there we don't assume such a thing. We'll see that in our door, a lot of this is actually more chamor, because this is only true by ksherim. But when you're talking about a parutz, which is much of our generation, then all of the rules change. We'll discuss that when we get into the Gemara. So that's the open of our Mishnah, that a man cannot be alone with two women lest something come to happen, and an isha achas is allowed to be with two men because we don't assume something will happen. Reb Shimon Omer, Af ish echad misyachedes im shtei nashim bizman sheishto imo. He says, wait, I can give a qualification where a man can be alone with two women. That provides that bizman sheishto imo, as long as his wife is there. V'yashen imo imohem bepundaki, and if she's staying with her husband in the pundaki, in the inn, because when a man's wife is around, she protects him from these kinds of averas. There's a principle in halacha called pas bisalo. Pas bisalo is a principle where, because a husband knows that he, at least at some point, will have access to his wife, he's less likely to violate any averas, because he knows that in theory, if not today, then tomorrow, if not tomorrow, then next week. But he knows that his wife is readily available for intimacy, so his yetzer hara is more in check.
Because of that, that doesn't make a steer on the first part.
If the wife is present, it's not a stira, it's just a different case. He's adding.
But it's still two women. But I understand the wife is different than just a stam woman, but
yeah,
the concept is still the same.
But ishto mishamarto, meaning whereas two regular women, there's a concern that the two women can be convinced or seduced to do that which the man wants. But when a man's wife is one of those two women, so the assertion is that ishto mishamarto, he's not willing to do the avera when he knows that he has his wife as an available outlet. That's what it seems. That's what it seems. Okay, end of the Mishnah. 3 lines before the end of the Mishnah, a quarter of the way down. We'll be heading, Mirza Hashem, to the top of Pei Aleph Amud Aleph with some throwbacks to Maseches Sota. Says the Gemara, Misyachedes Adam im imo v'im bito. A man is allowed to be alone with his mother and with his daughter, and v'yashen imahem b'kiruv basar, and they can even sleep near one another in the same bed without even being clothed. And that's perfectly mutter, says again, they're blood relatives. However, v'im higdilo, once somebody gets old enough, then it's not shaykh anymore. Zu yashana b'ksusa, v'zu yashen b'ksuso. A son can still lie in the same bed as his mother, provided that if he's older, provided that they're both clothed. That's what the Gemara says. Asks the Gemara, my taima, what is the reason why, and what is he talking about the first case of our Mishnah? Why is it that in the first case of our Mishnah, we said that a man cannot be alone with two women, and the Gemara calls it out openly? Tana de Be'elio, hoel v'noshim daitan kalos alehen. Because their das is kal, and Rashi says, like he says in the Gemara, like he says in the Mishnah, v'shtehen nochos lehis patos, both of them are nochos lehis patos, it's easy to convince them to do things. Minohani mili, where do we know this from? Namely, where do we know this idea of yichud from? Amar Rav Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shmuel, remez liyichud min haTorah minayin. Where is a remez for the fact that yichud is an isser deoraisa? And the Gemara pulls out a left field from a pasuk that deals with avodah zarah. Shene'emar, we're a third of the way down. Ki yasisecha achicha ben imecha. This pasuk again is talking about a child convincing someone to do avodah zarah. V'chi ben aim mesis. Why does the pasuk say ben aim, ben imecha, and ben av eino mesis? But the son of the man won't convince. Who cares what the genders are? We're afraid that someone might convince you to do avodah zarah. We're just concerned. Ella, says the Gemara, lo marlach ben misyachedim imo v'asher lisyachedim kol harayos shebetorah. Because the Torah went out of its way to say ben imecha, the Torah left a little bit of something for us to make a diuk on. And the extras in that pasuk teach us that only can a son be with his mother, but it's usher for a man to be with kol arayos shebetorah. It's usher for a man to be alone with any of the arayos that are listed in the Torah. Says the Gemara, Pashte de Krabemaiksiv. What was the basics of the pasuk talking about? The explicit parts of the pasuk, which we know is talking about avodah zarah. So the Gemara says halfway down, Amar Abaye, Lomi Boya Kamar. The pasuk was talking about a Lomi Boya. Obviously this, but even that. Lomi Boya ben Av. I know that the son of the father, the sonile, where there might be a dislike in that relationship, and he'll give some bad advice. Ella afilu ben aim, even if you're talking about a family member who is the son of his mother, and he's talking to somebody else in the family, delo sonile, where the relationship is good, perhaps we would assume that there would be a more open-minded opinion that's still going to be aser kamash malan. And says the Gemara, Nema, perhaps we should say that our Mishnah about Yichud is Masnisin de Loka Abba Shaul. What did Abba Shaul say to Tanya? The Brisa writes, this Brisa can be found in Maseches Moed Katan. We learned this, I don't even know when we learned Moed Katan, more than a year ago, probably, long time ago. No? That was more. I have no idea. I couldn't even tell you anymore. It's all a blur. All right. So the Gemara says in Moed Katan, Kol Shloshim Yom, and Rashi here just to our left contextualizes this because we're missing a lot of information here. Rashi Dibur Masol Kol Shloshim Yom, a horrible scenario. Vlad shemes besoch shloshim yom. If a child dies within 30 days of birth, ein sarich lechabdo b'moso lehotzia lekvura. We don't have to do a full-fledged burial with a whole processional, lo b'mita v'lo b'kliva, not with any type of thing that he lies on, ela b'cheik. We just carry the child as is and bury him that way without all of the regular pomp and circumstance of a funeral. So back in the Gemara, the Tanya, the Brisa writes, Kol shloshim yom, for those first 30 days, yotze b'cheik. This young child who Nebuch passed away, Rahman al-Islam passed away within the first 30 days, he's carried to his burial. The nikbar, be'isha achas b'shnei anashim, we don't need the regular 10 people who bury him. He can even be buried with one woman and 2 men. Aval, lo be'ish echad u'shtei nashim, but not with 1 man and 2 women. Why not? Because that was our Mishnah. What did our Mishnah say? That 1 man and 2 women, nochos lehis patos, nashim daitan kalosein, were afraid that they can be seduced. Aval, so says the Gemara, that's the Tanakama, but Abba Shaul Omer, no. Af be'ish echad v'shtei nashim. We see, says the Gemara, that Abba Shaul was of a different opinion. Abba Shaul felt that when this young child who was less than 30 days old was being buried, and he wasn't being buried under normal circumstances, that the entourage who takes him could even be 1 man and 2 women. Why is that allowed? That should be Hilchos Yichud. So clearly, or I should say, it should be at least a possibility that our Mishnah is not like Abba Shaul. Abba Shaul was of the opinion that 1 man with 2 women is allowed to bury, but our Mishnah called that case Yichud, Kasha. So is Abba Shaul the author of our Mishnah? Is he the contrarian opinion of our Mishnah? Yes or no? Says the Gemara, no. Our Mishnah is Afilu Tema Abba Shaul. B'shas aninus taver yitzrei. When a person is in aninus, in the severe pain of aninus, right in the immediate phase of losing someone before burial, taver yitzrei, the Gemara says, there is no yetzer hara under those cases. No one's going to do anything wrong. Now, this is very, very interesting. Where do we have halachos and chumash that apply only when your yetzer hara is in play? And that's it. That's a different question. Let's say the Torah says, for example, you're not allowed to. Well, I guess yichud is a weird example, but yichud, the Gemara is giving an exception to the rule. Abba Shaul says there's no isser yichud when the yetzer hara doesn't apply, except by kashrus. What about the isser hana by basar b'chalav? What if there's no yetzer hara? I'm in aninus. There's no yetzer hara to do averos. Can I now be in a case scenario that's an isser d'oraisa? It's very odd, very, very odd. But so says the Gemara. The Rabbanan Sabre Lak Rav Yitzchak. The Rabbanan, they argue against Abba Shaul. They say, "Da Amar Rav Yitzchak, Ma'is onen Adam Chai Gever al Chata'av." He learns the pasuk as follows: how can a person complain Gever al Chata'av afilu b'shas aninuso? Even when a person is in aninus. B'shas aninuso shel Adam, at the time when a person's in despair, still Yitzro miskaber alav. His yetzer hara is still in full throw, and it's based on that pasuk of Ma'is Onin. Abba Shaul. What would Abba Shaul do with that pasuk? Says the Gemara, Kiksiv hahu b'misraim al midosov ksiv. That pasuk wasn't talking about a yetzer hara during aninus, and still Abba Shaul holds stark to his opinion that there is no yetzer hara be'aninus. V'hachi kamar. That pasuk means as follows: Ma yisraim al midosov. How can a person get upset with HaKadosh Baruch Hu? After all, v'chi gavar al chata'av. Have you ever met anyone who's conquered all of their yetzer haras, who aren't deserving of any onshin? How can a person be upset when, I'm not judging, I'm quoting, how can a person be upset when something bad happens? It's not like they're perfect. It's not like we're deserving of perfection and perfect treatment. We're not perfect. We do averos all the time. So that's why the Gemara says, they should at least be happy that I let him live, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Abba Shaul says that pasuk is not a raya that there's a yetzer hara b'shas aninus. Lehefech, Abba Shaul holds that there is no yetzer hara b'shas aninus. Ay v'Rabbanan ki ahu ma'isa da'hi itza dahava uvda ve'apikte. They say that's actually not true. The rabbis say that they know of a case of a woman who created a ruse of pretending that a child had died within 30 days. She went out and was mizaneh in the cemetery. And that's so the Gemara says these are real cases, and we should be very concerned about a Yetzer Hara in these scenarios. The Gemara continues at the 8-9 lines from the bottom of the page on Pei Amud Beis. The Gemara says, Aval Isha Achas. This is the second line of our Mishnah at the top of the page. We had said that one woman is allowed to be in Yichud with two men. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda Marav Lo Shanu Ela Biksherim. When do we say that one woman can be with two men? That's only true when the men are ksherim. Aval beprutzim, but if the men are horribly inappropriate people, so then afilu be'asara namilo. Even 10 people won't change anything. You're not allowed to be alone with a chabura like that. And Havamaisa, there was a story like this. 10 men carried out one woman on a bed, and they were mizana with her in the cemetery. Unbelievable.
That's a story.
Yeah, we have had this before. You're correct. In Sota. That's what the Gemara says on the side. Yes, I have vague recollections. Amar Rav Yosef Teda, de michberi be'asara v'gan ve'kshura v'lo michsefe mehadade. That you can have people as a chabura who steal beams and they're not even embarrassed from one another. These things do happen. Says the Gemara, perhaps nema misayele. Perhaps we can say that we have a shiur from our Mishnah for the following. Mosrin lo shnei talmidei chachamim shema yavo aleh b'derech. In the case of a sota, when a husband is bringing his wife up to Yerushalayim so that she can go through the process of sota after he is mekana, he warns her, and then she's vinistera, she's being brought up to Yerushalayim. The halacha is that the Mei Sota will not work if the husband sleeps with her between the time that she is Nistera and the time of the Mei Sota. So the Gemara in Sota told us that they would send Shnei Talmidei Chachamim Shema Yavo Aleh B'derech because we were concerned that he might sleep with his wife on the way, and therefore that would ruin the Mei Sota. So they sent Shnei Talmidei Chachamim. So says the Gemara, Talmidei Chachamim in Shide Almalo. What we see here is that we require that they be Talmidei Chachamim and not regular people. Talmidei Chachamim, why? Because they are ksherim, but regular people are prutzim. So maybe we see from the Gemara and Sota a support to the idea that our Gemara just mentioned, that the reason we need Talmidei Chachamim is because they're ksherim. And in fact, one woman cannot be alone with any amount of men if those men are prutzim. So to this, the Gemara says that's not a raya. Last line of Pei Amud Beis, Shiny Talmidei Chachamim. There's a difference in regards to Talmidei Chachamim, to Yadei le'asru yebe, because they know how to give a proper hasra. They're halachically knowledgeable, but the average balabas is an am ha'aretz. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, lo shanu ela be'ir. When do we say, as Rashi highlights what the lo shanu means? The end of the first line of Rashi, going on to the second. Lo shanu de amrinan isha misyachedes im shnei anashim. When can one woman be alone with two men? That's only be'ir. Aval b'derech, when they're traveling, ad sheyihyu shlosha, until there are at least 3 men. Shema yitztarech echad mehen lehashin. Maybe one of the men would have to go urinate. He'll have to leave the group. V'nimsa echad misyached im ha'erva. And then there could be a potential for yichud. So says the Gemara, that there's a difference between the city where 2 men will suffice as long as they're ksherim, but on the pathway it has to be 3 men. Says the Gemara on Pei Aleph Amud Aleph, just a few more lines and then we'll stop. Nema misayele, perhaps we have a raya for this idea from the very same Mishnah. We tried to bring a raya for about ksherim versus prutzim. The Gemara says, Mosrin lo shnei talmidei chachamim shema yavo le'ah b'derech. In the Gemara Sota, we said that we send 2 men with her in addition to him. So it's the wife, it's the husband plus 2 more to ensure that there's never yichud with this woman. Says the Gemara, Trei ve'ihu, 2 men and the husband, hatzlasa. So perhaps this Gemara in Sota is a raya for the Shita of Rab that outside of the city we need 3 people. Says the Gemara, not correct. 5 lines down, 6 lines down on Pei Aleph Amud Aleph, Hasam ki hechi dinei havu alei sade. No, it's It's not because they need 3 people, but because we need the 2 Talmidei Chachamim to be Eidim. And yeah, that's right. But we need those 2 people to be Eidim, and that's why they have the 3 people. So no raya from here. Nevertheless, we still have the halachos that we learned, the added 2 halachos from this Gemara. Number 1, that if a person is a parutz, then they don't count as the appropriate people to be alone with a woman. They should never be in any group size with a woman if they're a parutz. Stay away from women if you're a parutz. And there would be an Isser Yichud, seemingly. And the Gemara says even with 10 people, if you have 10 people who are prutzim and they're with one woman, that's mamish Yichud. And as well, the extra din that Rav taught us was that when do we say that one woman can be alone with 2 men? That's only be'ir, but b'derech it has to be 3. We'll stop right here, 7 or 8 lines down on Pe Aleph Amud Aleph, and pick up tomorrow night. Tomorrow night we're learning in the main base medrash for our Mishmar LaArtzenu. We know that Torah is Magna Umatzla. We have to do our part, and we do our part with Daf Yomi, but we're going to join the Kol Torah in the main base medrash, so we'll find a tight spot to learn together. I'll try to speak a little louder so that we can all stay focused. Wishing you all a beautiful night.